Randolph Scott, Hollywood's stoic cowboy and the secrets he carried. He was the quiet man on the screen, tall in the saddle, unshakable in a stare-down, and always on the side of justice. But behind the silver screen hero that defined a generation of westerns stood a man whose real story was far more layered than Hollywood ever let on. Born George Randolph Scott on January 23, 1898, in the pastoral hills of Orange County, Virginia, he came from the kind of Southern lineage that prided itself on manners, honor, and restraint. His father, a public accountant, ensured order. His mother instilled grace. Their son would carry both through a life shaped by war, art, and the weight of carefully guarded secrets. Raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, Randolph's early life was a balance of academic drive and athletic prowess. He studied at Georgia Tech before transferring to UNC Chapel Hill, where his interest in theater began to blossom. But war interrupted youth. When World War I erupted, Scott enlisted, serving in France as an artillery observer. There, amid the chaos of the battlefield, he cultivated the internal stillness that would one day become his signature on screen. After the war, while many soldiers returned home to family farms or quiet office jobs, Scott set his sights westward, to Los Angeles. With help from family connections, he was introduced to none other than Howard Hughes, a meeting that cracked open Hollywood's gates. He began with small roles in silent pictures, but it wasn't long before his striking 6 feet 2 inches frame, square jaw, and dignified presence began turning heads. By the early 1930s, Scott was moving up Hollywood's ladder, starring in everything from action-adventure flicks to romantic comedies. But it wasn't until he saddled up for the westerns that audiences truly fell in love. Films like The Last of the Mohicans, 1936, and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, 1938, showed off his range. But the 1940s marked a turning point when he embraced the role of the lone cowboy, a symbol of strength, moral clarity, and restraint in an increasingly chaotic world. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Randolph Scott became an icon, not just of the Western, but of an American ideal. He wasn't loud like John Wayne or volatile like James Cagney. Scott was measured, steady, a man whose silence said more than most could with a monologue. Over the span of over 100 films, more than 60 westerns, Scott built a persona audiences came to trust. Whether it was Ride Lonesome, 1959, The Tall T, 1957, or Comanche Station, 1960, he brought a certain gravitas to every role. His frequent collaborations with director Bud Bodesher and screenwriter Burt Kennedy gave birth to what critics would later call the renowned cycle: minimalist, brooding tales that explored the psychology of the frontier man. These weren't just cowboy movies. They were moral puzzles told in dust and gunpowder. But perhaps what made Randolph Scott so compelling wasn't just what he showed, but what he withheld. There was a whisper behind the curtain, one that became a low hum in Hollywood's golden age, a question of identity, of authenticity, of silence worn like armor. Though he lived a life defined by traditional masculine roles, Scott moved through the industry with a private dignity, forming close bonds with a handful of actors who, like him, never felt safe enough to live openly. It is said that Scott privately acknowledged at least 6 actors he knew, men trapped behind the mask of studio-manufactured masculinity, who were gay and forced to hide it. Their names, never spoken aloud in press junkets or fan magazines, were exchanged only in trusted circles, behind locked doors. The fear of exposure wasn't just about reputation, it was about livelihood. Careers were lost with a whisper. Reputations crumbled under suspicion. For these men, discretion wasn't a preference, it was survival. While Randolph Scott never publicly labeled his own private life, his decades-long relationship with actor Cary Grant became the subject of widespread speculation. The two men shared a home for years, posed for domestic photographs, and took vacations together. Were they simply close companions or something more? The studios insisted it was just a publicity arrangement. The fan magazines printed them as Hollywood's most eligible bachelors. But the truth, if it existed beyond innuendo, stayed sealed behind closed doors. What is clear is this: Randolph Scott understood the suffocating cost of conformity and the danger of truth in a world ruled by image. His deep empathy for those who lived in hiding, including several of his peers, wasn't hypothetical. It came from lived experience, from the emotional arithmetic of deciding every day how much of yourself to give the world and how much to protect. By the early 1960s, Scott was done with Hollywood. His final film, Ride the High Country, 1962, was a quiet elegy to the kind of honor-bound hero he had always played. A cowboy fading into the sunset, he left acting on his own terms, with wealth accumulated from wise investments in oil and real estate and a legacy intact. But more than just a Western icon, Randolph Scott was a symbol of dualities: public hero, private man, stoic cowboy, quiet rebel. And in naming the actors he knew who had to conceal their truth, he revealed perhaps the most human part of himself: compassion. A curtain call in the saddle and the private life that refused the spotlight. When Ride the High Country hit theaters in 1962, few realized they were watching more than just a Western. Directed by the visionary Sam Peckinpah, the film was a poetic meditation on honor, aging, and the fading mythology of the American frontier. Randolph Scott, opposite fellow screen legend Joel McCrea, played one of two aging lawmen staring down the end of their era. It was quite simply the perfect farewell. Scott's final performance wasn't just a role, it was a reflection. A cowboy riding into the cinematic sunset, leaving behind dust, dignity, and legacy. After more than 3 decades on screen and over 100 films, many of them westerns that shaped the genre, Scott stepped away from acting with the kind of grace he had always brought to his work. He never chased Oscars, never pandered to trends, and yet, in his quiet steadiness, he earned something far more lasting: the unshakable respect of Hollywood. Actors admired his discipline. Directors praised his reliability. He was the actor who always showed up prepared, never complained, and made everyone around him better. While he never took home an Academy Award, his body of work became required viewing for filmmakers who cared more about storytelling than spectacle. Names like Clint Eastwood, Martin Scorsese, and Quentin Tarantino would later cite Scott's understated power and moral complexity as inspirations in their own explorations of cinematic justice. But behind the camera, Randolph Scott lived a far more private life, one that, to this day, invites speculation, admiration, and perhaps a quiet yearning for answers. The DuPont heiress and the Hollywood star Scott's first and most talked about marriage was not to another actor or someone from within Hollywood's orbit, but to Marion DuPont, the aristocratic horsewoman from one of America's most powerful industrial families. Their paths crossed in a storybook twist worthy of fiction. Marion, a champion equestrian and socialite with roots in the East Coast elite, had once been married to George Somerville, a noted Virginia horse breeder. At their wedding, Randolph Scott stood as the best man. Years later, that same best man would become her husband. In 1936, Scott and Marion DuPont wed, uniting two very different worlds: his, grounded in scripts and sound stages; hers, steeped in lineage, wealth, and thoroughbreds. Her family, the DuPonts, were not just rich, they were legacy. Her great-grandfather, Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, had founded the chemical empire that would become DuPont, a corporate juggernaut that shaped global industry, from gunpowder to nylon to automotive innovation. For a brief moment, their union seemed like something out of high society fairy tales, the dashing actor and the elegant heiress. But the glamour belied the reality: a marriage that couldn't hold the reins. Despite the prestige of their union, the marriage between Scott and DuPont lasted only 3 years, ending in divorce in 1939. Why it fell apart remains the subject of quiet speculation. Some point to their vastly different lifestyles: Scott, grounded in the grit of Hollywood, and Marion, loyal to the traditions and social rituals of the East Coast equestrian world. Others wonder if, as with many celebrity marriages of the era, the pairing had more to do with public image than personal connection. One can't help but sense that the relationship may have been doomed by design, a collision between two parallel paths that were never meant to merge. Scott, intensely private, never publicly elaborated on the reasons for their split, and Marion returned to her world of horse racing and philanthropy, never remarrying. Their short-lived union would remain one of the few glimpses into Randolph Scott's personal life, a life he guarded with the same stoicism that defined his on-screen characters. A marriage built on quiet devotion, No children were born during Randolph Scott's first marriage, and some close to the couple later reflected that the union may have been doomed not by scandal, but by simple incompatibility. Marion DuPont Scott, with her lifelong devotion to Virginia's equestrian culture, lived and breathed an aristocratic rhythm far removed from the relentless demands of Hollywood. Scott, by contrast, was fully committed to his cinematic ascent in California. Two worlds, two temperaments, and ultimately, two destinies that diverged. And yet, there remained a strange tenderness between them. Despite their divorce, Marion chose to keep the name Scott, and for nearly 5 decades, until her death in 1983, she continued to be known as Marion DuPont Scott. It may have been a subtle act of respect, or perhaps a quiet nod to a man who, however briefly, had shared her life. Marion's legacy flourished apart from Hollywood. She transformed the Montpelier estate in Virginia, once the home of President James Madison, into a premier center for equestrian excellence, a testament to her love of horse racing and preservation. Her philanthropic vision led to the estate eventually being endowed to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where it continues to educate and inspire. Patricia Stillman, the great love of his life. It wasn't until 1944, in the midst of World War II and at the pinnacle of his fame, that Randolph Scott found what many believe was his true partner in life. Patricia Stillman. A former actress, Patricia was 21 years his junior, but brought with her not the allure of celebrity, but the grounded grace of someone who valued home over headlines. Their union was quietly powerful, lasting more than 4 decades. While Hollywood's golden couples often made waves for their affairs or fallouts, Randolph and Patricia lived without tabloid drama, choosing instead a life of elegant seclusion. Patricia left the industry soon after they married, retreating from the screen to focus on family and her role as a partner. In 1950, they adopted 2 children, Sandra and Christopher, a deeply personal decision that may have been shaped by medical or emotional reasons, but which reflected their sincere desire to build a family away from the Klieg lights of stardom. By the mid-1950s, Scott was intentionally slowing his career, prioritizing fatherhood over film sets. His home in Beverly Hills became a sanctuary of calm, where the actor was not Randolph Scott, the Western icon, but a man devoted to his wife and children. When Scott passed away in 1987, Patricia remained by his side to the end. She would live until 2001, preserving not only his memory, but also the quiet dignity that had defined their shared life. Their marriage became a rare gem in Hollywood history, not loud, not scandalous, but resilient. Rooted in loyalty and mutual respect, Hollywood's most intimate secret. While Randolph Scott built a carefully guarded personal image, the stoic hero, the faithful husband, the family man, Hollywood had a shadow side, one that pulsed quietly beneath the glittering surface. In private conversations near the end of his life, Scott allegedly broke his silence about a truth he had long carried, not just about himself, but about those he had known and loved within the studio system. According to interviews whispered in confidence and documents revisited in recent biographies, Scott quietly named 6 actors he had known intimately, 6 giants of the golden age, who were gay but forced to live behind masks, casualties of a system that prized illusion over truth. Among those names was one that continues to ignite fascination and speculation: Cary Grant. Of all the names Scott mentioned, Cary Grant was not merely a colleague, he was a chapter. For decades, rumors swirled around the relationship between the 2 men, beginning in the early 1930s when they shared a beach house in Santa Monica. The tabloids referred to it as Bachelor Hall, and while fans adored the photos of Grant and Scott barbecuing, golfing, and lounging poolside, insiders quietly murmured another story, one of genuine companionship, perhaps even love. Though both men would eventually marry women, the intimacy they shared was unlike any other in their lives. According to friends, their bond surpassed friendship. It was a partnership forged not just from comfort, but mutual understanding in a world that offered neither of them the freedom to live openly. A silent testament to a generation's pain. When Randolph Scott recalled the names of those 6 men, Cary Grant, Montgomery Clift, Merv Griffin, Jim Nabors, Cesar Romero, and Rock Hudson, he wasn't engaging in idle remembrance or scandalous gossip. He was offering a quiet testimony, a rare window into a world where truth was a liability. and authenticity had to be carefully buried beneath layers of persona, contracts, and cinematic illusion. To name them was not to expose them. It was, in Scott's own understated way, to honor them, not just as stars, but as men who lived with both brilliance and burden. Each of these actors shaped American culture in indelible ways, while simultaneously being denied the most basic human freedoms: to live openly, to love publicly, to be known for who they truly were. Scott knew their pain because he had lived beside it. He had shared breakfasts and beach days with Cary Grant, watched Monty Clift unravel under the weight of perfectionism and secrecy, and observed the lonely resolve behind Merv Griffin's polished showman smile. These weren't anecdotes. They were elegies for a generation of men whose truth had to be encrypted into coded glances and unspoken understandings. Hollywood in the mid-20th century controlled stars, forcing them to live dual lives. Gay men like Cary Grant and Montgomery Clift faced immense pressure, navigating public personas while concealing their true identities. Randolph Scott later acknowledged this struggle, emphasizing that their tragedy lay in the restriction of their authentic selves. His legacy, preserved at UCLA, reflects a commitment to integrity and courageous survival amid societal constraints.